Shakespeare's Richard II is one of Shakespeare's most explicitly political plays, a deep exploration of kingship that helped Ernst Kantorowicz formulate his conceptualization of the ideological mechanisms of kingship in The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology. Richard II has been translated into French 10 times since the early 1990s. This paper will study Frédéric Boyer's 2010 translation, Tragédie du roi Richard II, for Jean-Baptiste Sastre's theatrical production presented in Avignon in July 2010. The project was initiated by the conversation of 3 theatre professionals on the play, Boyer, Sastre and actor Denis Podalydès, who performed the title role. The conversation led to the writing of a text which became the foreword to the published translation, with extracts from this foreword used for the promotional texts of the production. Boyer engaged in a deep and radical political reflection on the play, asking explicitly, quote, "By the way, who are the kings? Where do they come from? What if there had been kings only in the imaginary place of our expectations? Are we responsible for this sovereign power, for the very power that governs us, sometimes all the way to injustice and ignominy?" End quote. His project is radical in 2 senses. First, it develops a strongly political conceptualization of Richard II that produces an anarchist deconstruction of leadership, and secondly, it traces the origins of kingship to its ideological root. Analyzing this adaptation project, the intentions and perspectives at its origins, the translation choices and the theatrical production, I will explore the relevance of Shakespeare's Richard II to contemporary questions of leadership. Images of the loss of reality are present in the play, but this adaptation manages to bring them to light, and the first of them are reality checks imposed on Richard by his uncle, John of Gaunt, around the physical limits of his power. "King you are, but without the power to give me 1 more minute. 1 word from you and I am dead, but from death you cannot buy back my breath." Gaunt reminds Richard that he is subjected to the laws of the cosmos, powerless in the face of time and death, and deludes himself to think otherwise. Images of nonsensical implosion appear in Act 2 to illustrate how self-destructive Richard's behavior is. Gaunt, feeling he is a prophet new inspired, begins his famous septodial speech, often interpreted as unequivocally patriotic by an older generation of Shakespeare fans, except it is framed by 2 images of paradox that lament the way the country is governed. Gluttonous cormorant, who, having swallowed everything, ends preying on itself. This perfect image of paradox, imagined in a mind's eye, becomes a deeply illogical vision of implosion. "England you have just shamefully lost against yourself, for that England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself." These words, very popular in performance in the UK in the context of Brexit, not only shape a similar image to the cormorant swallowing itself, but it indicates how leaders can act completely against the benefit of their own country when they prioritize their self-interest. When John of Gaunt dies, his brother Edmund, Duke of York, relays him in condemning Richard's behaviour as he seizes Gaunt's inheritance. "You deny our time, you amputate this day from its tomorrow, you are no longer your own self." At this moment, time itself is endangered by Richard's outrageous theft of his deceased uncle's belongings. The fact that it will be used to finance a war in Ireland doubles the proof that Richard acts out of self-interest. Later, more paradoxes come back to Richard's words to describe his own implosion. "I had forgot myself. Not even the name of my baptism, it was usurped from me." His sense of self vanishes into nothingness in the process of his deposition, as he will expand on later, including in a prison scene where he vainly tries to believe himself to be Richard without believing himself king. The character of Aumerle, Richard's cousin and future 2nd Duke of York, was transformed in the production into a jester character. As such, he carried a subversive potential through the irreverence towards and interrogation of kingship that is usually associated with the role of the jester. When returning from Ireland, Richard, as he said "farewell king" in English, put his crown on Aumerle's head. Aumerle gesticulated as if possessed or in a shaking trance, going twice around Richard, and eventually fell stiff as if dead. Then during Richard's hollow crown speech, Aumerle looked through the hollow crown, acting puzzled. Later in the scene of the confrontation between Richard and Bolingbroke, Aumerle, weeping, blew his nose in Richard's royal robes. In the foreword to his translation, Boyer engages in a Foucauldian archaeology of the construct of kingship, which reveals it as a paradox. He claims that Shakespeare, through Richard, denounces the impossibility to symbolize the body of power, because there are only human bodies to do this with. In other words, the embodiment of power in the body of one man is paradoxical in the first place, a concept which is developed throughout the foreword. He points out that Richard transgresses the very law he is supposed to be the source of, therefore simultaneously imposing laws and his own freedom from them, a contradiction which is at the core of the construct of sovereign power. Richard's histrionics in Act 4, as he is formally deposed, have a political purpose. He literally makes a scene of a transition of power that Bolingbroke would prefer to be as smooth as possible. Richard's consent is a given, but since he has no effective power left, but it only comes at the precise moment when it can subvert the paradox of power. His scorched earth tactics of taking down the ceremony with him in his downfall is performed in front of the same dukes who will rebel against Henry IV within a few years. It seems valid then to interpret the play as a tragedy of Richard, victim of ideology and the paradox of power, as Boyer claims. The characters who oppose Richard's abuses of power multiply images of paradox to illustrate what these abuses mean to them. The enhanced irony of Bolingbroke's "Our breath of kings" points out that taking a man's word as law in the first place makes no sense, thus the construct of lawmaking kingship is attacked again. Shortly before his death, Gaunt reproaches Richard his maverick attitude as sovereign. "You are the law, and you are now the slave of law, for thy state of law is bondslave to the law." Soon after he tells Richard, "Your life is your shame, but your shame will not die with you." This particular moment in Gaunt's attack creates a reversal of the logic of continuity in the king's body politic, defined by reputation, as Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, had argued in Act 1, Scene 1, that reputation was everything he had as a nobleman. This reversal of construct, central to the ideology of kingship, rewrites the king's body politic as a body of eternal shame. Boyer observes that Richard's Christomimites, in Greek playing, miming, representing Christ, which is a foundational construct of his kingship, collapses as a belief, which constitutes a failure of ideology that amounts, in Boyer's words, to bankruptcy, as we witness a renouncement of the holiness of the role of king. Richard, in the bare life of his imprisonment, waiting only for death in a dungeon, finds salvation in a desperate acknowledgement of his marginality, in the inner exile of his alienation. Boyer reminds us that Richard goes very far in the bitter self-destruction of the myth he embodies, to the point of comparing himself to a little whore resorting to dig her own grave with her own tears. Richard bitterly reveals the paradoxical emptiness of power within his very own body, just in time before he is murdered, and just in time for us to empathize with him after all. Deeper processes are at work in the play than just the collapse of Richard's reign, and these processes shape a nightmare from the perspective of political theology. But as the ancient phrase goes, who is the dreamer? The long nightmare of the West, according to Boyer, is political anarchy, and its resolution by sovereign authority. He sees in the play a reversal of the doctrine of the king's two bodies. Power is entangled in its own bloody nightmare. In an interview he explained, "This unjust king, all-powerful, this god-king, is also this weak king, this king in love, this narcissistic king, this dead king still alive. No one maintains any longer the traditional representation of the god-king, because it appears that this archaic conception of royal power is itself a dream or a nightmare. What is really sacrilegious, if anything, is power itself. To perform it is treason. To lose it is to lose the ability to abandon it. To seize it is to clasp emptiness." In Boyer's words, the nightmare is presented as the experiential manifestation of turmoil, but rather than a cosmological disturbance, as in Macbeth or Julius Caesar, this nightmare represents the chaotic collapse of an ideological dream. An insistence is made on the contradictions inherent to sovereign power and the fundamental problems of its very existence. This interpretation recalls James Joyce's words in Ulysses, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." Brought to the context of this production, this statement resonates as its main aesthetic principle. It further evokes a cyclical conception of history that echoes in Shakespeare's history plays, where each king is replaced by another, providing dramatic closure without resolving the ongoing issues raised by the instability and violence resulting from the hierarchies of monarchical power. Destroying kingship is not so simple. Richard tries to become unkinged and master of no one, an empty symbol, but the vacancy of power is filled before it is even created at all, and the new king, Henry IV, immediately calls himself betrayed, hurt, and a fugitive pilgrim. Sovereignty can only be torn apart, not shared. It excludes instead of gathering. As soon as we have a new leader, they are already a murderous bastard, and it seems like the role is simply incompatible with just governance. Does power inevitably corrupt the body? Boyer points to the inner workings of ideology and power. Sovereignty is no longer an external force, it camps within us, in our flesh, like a menacing hostage. As I quoted earlier, Boyer asks if we are responsible for the sovereign power that governs us with so much injustice. If we are, then what are we supposed to do? Boyer thinks that the sovereign body keeps the trace of an archaic and imaginary desire for absolute power, that this desire is within us and must be neutralized. The paradox of power is in our own bodies, and the vertigo of vanity in the king's body is mirrored by a ritual haunting in our bodies. Boyer is not too hopeful about our options. Shakespeare's kings show us how impossible it is for us to reconcile not only with each other but with ourselves. And when Boyer speaks of unkinged kings keeping alive a ghostly sovereignty in unending civil wars, I think of our deeply decisive voting systems that force us to argue which of two awful individuals is going to be the least harmful for the country. Richard's implosion is represented through numerous images of nonsense and paradox, but because it is linked to kingship as a construct, it is more than the collapse of an individual's sense of self. A bankruptcy occurs at the level of ideological discourse. This failure of the ideology of kingship reveals the nightmare in which we are, and the work that Michel Foucault says we are yet to achieve. In this context, Frédéric Boyer says, "The king is dead, long live the king," becomes a call for murder, a paradoxical proof of the vacancy and inversion of power. In the end, there are no longer either gods or masters, only bastards forced to do evil things. What Boyer only hints at, though, in his translation and its foreword, is that this work must be done within ourselves. If you are tired of hierarchies and their destructive blindness, then you must ask yourself, who should have power over you? The anarchist answer is yourself, not a ruling class making appalling decisions in your name and governing your life. You must find within yourself this sovereignty over yourself and start creating the world you want to live in. In small groups, just as much as in entire nation states, we need to refuse and remove hierarchies and share sovereignty as equal voices. Removing the king, then, is a work for us to do within, and Shakespeare's theatre works only as a catalyst for this realization. The tragedy of King Richard II can thus be interpreted as our tragedy, the tragedy of our failure to engage in the fight for the world we dream of.